Good morning, Barcelona, and hello, internets. I am really grateful to be here to talk a little bit about learning and hopefully give a new perspective or just a really affirming perspective for some of you who may share some of my ideas about continuous learning. So what I'm going to do is briefly talk about what I mean when I say continuous learning, and then also look at the cultures that create environments where continuous learning is possible. Because we'll find that culture actually makes a huge difference in how far we can go with our learning. So in case this sounds a little vague, you're not really sure if the idea of cultures of continuous learning are interesting to you, I just wanted to see if any of you are interested in any of these things. Humanity, the future, great performance, high performance, lowering your risk, both personally and on your teams or project groups or companies, or innovation. So it's very dark, so I probably can't see a show of hands, but I'm just going to assume some of you are into some of these things, and so we may have a reason to be here today. So continuous learning is essentially a very simple allusion to continuous integration. So it's continuous integration for your brain, and it's actually kind of how the human brain works anyway. So I'm just going to lay out a few components, and I apologize for the massive text, but I wanted to make this useful for the rest of the internets. So humans are taking in information constantly. So now some of you are probably actively listening to what I'm saying or thinking about what was just said, but you're also taking in a lot of information from around you. So continuous learning is actually not necessarily a choice that you make. It's something that's happening automatically because it's how the human brain works. So I just want to start with that. But the way that we become more powerful, as we've seen in building technology systems and everything else, is by managing and kind of optimizing for how humans already work. So continuous learning also includes managing that learning and sort of building up to the fact that we should always be doing continuous learning. Deliberate practice is actually a sort of a clinical word that I encourage all of you to look more into, because it's actually one of the fundamental drivers that helps create expertise, not just sort of being familiar with something, but deliberately engaging and practicing in that learning, so active learning. And the truth is that a lot of studies starting in around the 90s or becoming more prominent around the 90s have shown that humans learn best in small chunks, actually, and that we do best when we engage in a small chunk of information and then revisit it on, say, a 30-day increment and then maybe a 60-day increment. And it varies based on the size of the information and how it integrates with our projects or our environments. But the truth is, the sort of model of really intense long-term study was never really the right model for humans anyway. And now that we live in the information age and most of us work in the technology industry, we're kind of confronting the fact that the way we've structured our education or our learning opportunities doesn't actually work the way we work. So learning in small chunks over time is really important to both continuous learning and just humans doing our best learning. Another core aspect is to maintain a working version at all times, and that's a little bit of a pun. So one version of maintaining a working version is sort of like the software and continuous integration identity of making sure that you don't get so focused on learning that you stop doing. You kind of always want to be doing both. You want to be learning and then practicing and integrating your learning into your practice. But it also means literal, like keeping a job while you're learning is a really valuable thing. And we're kind of seeing that learning opportunities, with massive open online courses and events like Velocity and conferences and things, we're seeing a lot more ways where we can engage in learning and improving our skills and our knowledge without having to completely abandon our day jobs, which is really important. I believe it was Dave Thomas, who's actually the author of the Agile Manifesto, who actually put in the exact words on a Ruby Rogues podcast earlier this year that whenever you start to get comfortable with something, one of the best ways to challenge your skills is, as soon as you get comfortable, to fork a process, fork a process within your brain and start exploring something different, and always try to be integrating those branches again. And I think that analogy, especially for those of us who spend a lot of our time thinking about continuous integration and continuous delivery models, it's a really good paradigm for thinking about our learning. And then this sort of subtle side note that I put in the bottom is that, by the way, in case you're thinking that this is optional, it's not. This is not only how to optimize your learning, but the truth is that a lot of the work Kathy Sierra has done and referencing work of Daniel Kahneman and a lot of great education and learning and memory researchers, indicates that if you don't practice, if you're not continually learning, we kind of think that your skills are going to improve, you keep learning, and then you're an expert, and then you just stay an expert until proven otherwise. But the truth is that humans are not that reliable, and you actually just get worse. So you want to be not only improving and continually learning in order to expand your knowledge, but even just to keep the knowledge that you think you have now. So yeah, sorry for the harsh reminder, but I like to start aspirational and then kind of remind, like, you can't really opt out. So a really important attribute of being able to accomplish anything in social groups, obviously none of us are actually learning in a vacuum. It's not an entirely independent activity. Even if we engage with small bits of information independently, is actually influenced by our culture. And my favorite definition of culture, as it's a pretty large, all-encompassing buzzword, is that culture is the attitudes and behaviors of social groups. And the reason I highlight both attitudes and behaviors is because on the attitude level, on the surface, if you ask people if they believe in learning, they're always going to say yes. But we'll find that that's not always true. So having sort of an active attitude that embraces learning is really important. We'll talk about some specific ways to show that. And then behaviors are also really core, because no matter what you say to me about what you think about learning, what matters is what you do, how much time you spend, how much money you spend, and what kind of resources you dedicate toward fostering environments of learning and toward managing your own learning. So I'm going to kind of go back and forth during this talk between you as an individual who is a learner and you as leaders in different project groups and teams in various contexts in your lives. Okay, so a core attitude of continuous learning actually opens up some really great opportunities for us. And so a pro-continuous learning environment has this baseline of just that everyone is expected to be learning. So within a company, that would be at your company, if everyone from the CEO to the mailroom attendant is expected to be learning something new every day, or to approach their job in a way that integrates what they already know with what they have to learn going forward, you see a really significant cultural shift. And it also enables us to combat some of the biggest psychological aspects of the human condition. So what I want to cover is that cultures of continuous learning actually help combat stereotype threat. And stereotype threat is basically a syndrome where someone who is a member of a group that has been negatively stereotyped for performance then basically lives up to that stereotype because of their awareness. So one that I've always heard about is the idea that girls are bad at math. So if I'm a girl and I'm taking a math test and I'm aware of the stereotype that girls are bad at math, it is likely that I will perform less well on that test simply because of the stereotype. And this has been borne out through research, but so that dynamic and that sort of potential for a lack of performance that doesn't actually represent my math competence is called stereotype threat. And when you create an environment where everyone is expected to be learning and where everyone is sort of affirmed in their role as a learner and not necessarily as just the roles that they already represent or the things that they came in the door with, they actually find that they're free to display their actual knowledge and their actual abilities. And that has been proven to actually basically nullify stereotype threat. So it can be overcome with positive affirmations and with an environment where their potential is emphasized more than the existing stereotypes. So basically you get better performance by taking away that issue, taking away the detriments of stereotype threat. There's also an impact on imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome is something that a lot of professionals, particularly in the technology industry, experience. And it's basically the feeling that you're a fraud and that someday someone's going to come and figure you out, that you've been pretending you know things about web operations. Maybe you've even been speaking in public about it, and someone is going to call you on it. And what research has shown is actually that imposter syndrome is very common among the most accomplished, the most well-researched, and basically there's not really a correlation between actual imposters and imposter syndrome. Essentially, really great people who have a lot to share get imposter syndrome. And so if you are creating an environment where everyone is focused on what they have to learn next, then you make it less detrimental for them. If it's okay to be an imposter, then you're going to attract the people who are really outstanding, really well qualified, and maybe are experiencing imposter syndrome, they can still feel comfortable contributing to your team. And then one of my favorites along this whole corollary of cultures of continuous learning is embracing the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is actually sort of a corollary. It's related to imposter syndrome, but it's essentially the phenomenon where competence is in no way correlated with confidence. So someone who kind of says they're the best at something, that really has no indication of them actually being great at it. And a lot of times people who are extremely confident are not necessarily very competent, and vice versa. And so by embracing the Dunning-Kruger effect and looking for people who are very aware of the sort of limitations of their own knowledge and who are more motivated by the things that they have left to learn, you are able to attract some of the best people. Because the best people aren't necessarily going to say, aren't necessarily going to want to be in an environment where they think they have to know absolutely everything already. So there's some huge benefits to attitudes of continuous learning. I'm going to do a quick case study of an organization that I co-founded called Girl Develop It. And we've actually built, it's a nonprofit. We teach introductory computer programming courses focused on women. But the organization was founded on cultures of continuous learning. And it's something, the sort of cultural aspects of the courses have made a huge difference over time. So we're now a little bit over 4 years old, and we've taught over 16,000 women to code. And the two major aspects of the program that I want to emphasize are, one, that we were able to combat stereotype threat by starting from day one saying that we believe that women can code, and that women 18 plus can continue to learn software development skills. That it's not too late, that opportunity isn't gone, and that you can, there's still an opportunity there. And so that combats stereotype threat. And even more importantly is that the fundamental tenet of a Girl Develop It classroom, and this is now true across 47 cities in the United States and Canada, is a judgment-free learning environment. So not only are there introductions to web concepts and different sort of technical courses, but it's okay to ask questions. And it's okay to not come in knowing everything already. And we actually emphasize the role of asking questions in the Girl Develop It classroom. And we found we have so 16,000 women total students, and we've also had women become entrepreneurs, sort of launch their own products. I know there are a lot of Etsy engineers here today. We have some full-time engineers at Etsy who started as Girl Develop It students years ago, and it's really awesome to see that development that all came from basically fostering a focus on continuous learning and a focus on the opportunity of learning rather than sort of erecting barriers for people in technology. Okay, so this is very flexible. I'm running low on time, so I'm gonna have to go through some of these quickly. But I emphasized attitudes and behaviors earlier. So behaviors, these are some very specific things, actions that you can take and things that your company can spend time and money on to encourage continuous learning within your teams. So conferences are an obvious one, and I'm sure one that many of you are convinced of given the fact that you're here. And I also just want to specifically say not only attending conferences, but funding conferences, sponsoring conference events, and sending your team to conferences are huge game changers in terms of continuous learning. And the few days that you may miss from work are absolutely worth it in terms of the long-term model and just fundamentally how humans learn. Meetups are sort of conference light on a local level. Absolutely recommend them. Lunch and learns have become very common. Basically the idea, and something specific to lunch and learns, is that you'll basically have a small group where the company buys lunch and they will get together and learn from ideally their peers, or ideally different representatives from different technical teams within the company. So a lunch and learn should not be your VP of engineering or your CEO kind of giving a lecture to your team. It should be all about anyone being able to showcase anything that they've learned, and everyone of all levels being able to learn during that period. Another really common successful behavior of continuous learning that we've seen in teams, large and small, are book clubs. So I've heard some successful book clubs studying books that are related to like web operations or the exact topics that a team's struggling with at the time. But some of the more innovative ones that I've also heard, one from the Amplify engineering team they do K-12 education, they're based in New York, is actually the idea of a book club where you're studying a technical book for something that no one on your team knows. So they kind of level the playing field. And I know a team of Ruby and Android engineers. They work on a mobile app with a Ruby on Rails backend, and they are all studying Scala together. And Scala, I never say that right. And so book clubs can be really interesting and also just a nice way to like switch gears from some of the, from the internet reading, take a break from Hacker News and read a paper book every now and then. But it's great to add that social dimension to book clubs. Another concept I wanted to introduce is the idea of code clubs, which to my knowledge was introduced, or I've heard most about it from a woman named Saran Yitbarek, who's based in New York. She actually somewhat recently graduated from the Flatiron School, and now she runs a program called Code Newbie, which is a podcast and online chat for people learning to code and learning coding skills. And they run some really great groups of basically five people get together and read through open source code bases in small chunks at a time. So like every Sunday morning, they'll look through 100 lines of code and talk through it. They find that social element in a very finite, small amount of code is really productive. So I also want to share a few other motivational words from a frequent Velocity character. The CTO of Rent the Runway, Camille Fournier, is an amazing person, and she gave a talk last year in New York called How to Stay in Love with Programming. And one of the things that really stuck with me out of her talk was the idea of cultivating a beginner's mind. And she sort of spoke to it from the perspective of being really experienced and trying to get yourself out of the mindset where you think you have nothing to learn because you've totally seen it all before. I'm sure a lot of us, as we get more experience, have that feeling, but it's really productive to try to revisit even the things that you are most expert at, the things that you don't necessarily feel like you're learning in. Try to revisit them as if you were new. Work with people who are learning them for the first time and really get yourself into that headspace, because you'll find that it gives you a whole new perspective even on the things that you consider yourself already knowing. Another great continuous learner that I like to highlight is Dwight Merriman. He's actually currently the chairman and founder of MongoDB. He previously founded DoubleClick and a handful of other really successful internet companies. And I found recently, actually about a week ago, that I asked him how he keeps up with technology, and he says that he actually spends about a third of his time coding. So he recently, left the role of CEO to work as chairman so that he could spend more time digging into BSON implementations and sort of sharing some of that work on GitHub. So I think if Dwight Merriman can spend, a third of his time focused on what he sees as learning and keeping up with his craft, then all of us could absolutely, take that cube to learn more or to focus more on continuous learning. And so just to wrap up, some of the things that we win when we foster cultures of continuous learning are humanity. It's fundamental to our nature, and it's also sort of fundamental. Human adaptability is one of our greatest strengths, and we can, really optimize on that when we're also learning and keeping up with technology. Eric Hoffer, a social change expert and mass movement expert, said, "In times of drastic change, it is the learners who inherit the future." And I think most of us can agree that the technology industry is like a giant time of drastic change all the time. It's like the whole case of our entire industry. And so if we want to inherit the future, we've got to all identify as learners and manage that. And by making small changes, we're actually lowering risk. So we're actually lowering risk overall by investing in people and facilitating continuous learning. And when you combat things like stereotype threat and you nullify imposter syndrome and you embrace the Dunning-Kruger effect, you actually are able to attract a lot better people to your teams, which improves performance. You're also able to expand what's called the adjacent possible by allowing people to pursue a lot of different avenues of thought and learning, which boosts innovation and then happiness. So thank you very much.